will have to follow the lesson plan, communicate with only 10% of his or her students, and then rely on the Aral intervention program so that the 90% can catch up. Sana, in this particular case, kasi it's obvious that it's either the teacher is not an effective teacher or the lesson plan is really to start with beyond already the competence or proficiency of the students from class day 1. So therefore, there should be some flexibility for the teacher to slow down the pace. I mean, back to basics yan, back to basics for the next 5 or 2 weeks so that the 90% can catch up.
Yeah, Mr. President.
Bago ang lahat, siguraduhin nakasubscribe kayo sa ating channel para lagi kayong ma-update sa totoong pangyayari sa ating bansa. Hanggang mga balita, atin sa inyo na, Bali Totoo!
Thank you, Mr. President. We have been recognized earlier. So if I may continue with my interpellation with our hardworking committee chairman, Mr. President. Last time, during the first round of my interpellation on the Aral bill, we established that this is mandatory. I think that was the word used by our chairman, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I used the term mandatory. However, after the interpellation and the comments from our good minority leader, I think the more appropriate word is required of the student, especially those students who fall below the minimum requirement or the minimum proficiency levels, and those who did not attend school year 2020 and beyond.
What would be, so we are spreading into the records, Mr. President, that it is not mandatory but required. What would be the significant difference with this change in the wording that we are, the descriptive word that we are using, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, mandatory normally has some form of penalty if you don't attend the program, Mr. President. But in this particular case, it will be required to a sense that if the students cannot attend the intervention program, there will be no penalty or punishment to the student.
Because this is being done for the student, actually, Mr.
Yes,
President.
Mr. President.
I mean, siguro meron tayong minimum basic responsibility naman sa sarili rin natin that we want, di ba, we want to also improve ourselves, and if there is a test required in school, we should pass that test. I mean, that impulse should come from the person, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, that's absolutely correct, Mr. President. However, students encounter different difficulties in school, Mr. President, and there are so many reasons: family, income, status in life, and that's why it's important to have intervention programs so that those students will be helped and those students can cope up with the rigids of their studies.
At kailan mo ba ito mag-umpisa, itong intervention natin? At what grade level, Mr. President?
It will start from kindergarten all the way to grade 10.
So sa kinder pa. So
K to 10.
All levels, and then
Except for senior high school, Mr. President.
to 10. So
Yeah.
wala na sa 11 and 12.
Wala na po, Mr. President.
Why is that so, Mr. President?
Well, Mr.
Hindi ba ito yung mga, if they're really behind and not knowledgeable about the fundamentals, they can never now cross over to higher education, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, based on the, I showed a slide earlier, based on the studies of World Bank, 11 and 12 learners are normally called independent learners. And during the pandemic, they managed to keep up using the self-learning modules, Mr. President. So, in other words, the regression with 11 and 12 is not as significant compared to the younger ages, Mr. President. So the normal schooling or the face-to-face classes can actually help them keep up with their academics, Mr. President. So this slide, Mr. President, this is a slide from World Bank. And basically what it's saying, the younger you are, the more difficult for the child to learn. Because the younger kids are called, they will need their parents, or they will need assistance in terms of learning. The older you are, you're an independent learner. That means you can learn on your own. The regression was not as significant as the younger learners, Mr. President.
What does this chart or graph signify, Mr. President? How do we interpret this one, Mr. President? So for that 6 year, for the 6 on the, ano ba to? Horizontal axis 6, it's child's age, and then there is a segment from 0 to around 15%. What does that mean, Mr. President?
The World Bank surveyed low-income household earners. No, basically this is probably 70 to 80% of all our learners in our public schools. And basically, World Bank asked them if you learn or not. And of course, there were also assessments that were conducted. And basically, what World Bank is telling us using this slide is the older you are, the more you have learned. And the younger you are, the less effective the self-learner modules are, Mr. President. So that's why we're targeting the 6-year-olds all the way to 10-year-old, Mr. President. So K to 10, Mr. President.
Yes, grade 10 would be around what age, Mr. President?
Okay, 16.
Yeah, 16.
16. Sorry, 6 years old to 16 years old, Mr. President. So it's the grade levels is K to 10. The age level
anyway,
is 6 to 16.
So can we keep that on the screen, Mr. President, that slide? No, but okay. Section 2 gives us the coverage of the Aral program. What is our estimate, sir, Mr. President, of the number of learners covered by the Aral program if we retain the wording of Section 2?
Yes, Mr. President. Again, in the absence of an assessment, we use a proxy, Mr. President. And the proxy that we use is also a survey from World Bank. This is their survey on learning poverty. I'll show that on the slide, Mr. President. So we're using the 90.9% of learners who cannot read. No? This is the proxy that we use because we don't have the actual assessment. So 90% times the number of learners for K to 6 is about 12.7 million. For K to 10 is about 19.5 million, Mr. President. So that is the universe that we are looking at, Mr. President.
Assumption is 90%.
Yes, that's
90, yeah,
of course.
Across the K to 10 grade levels, 90% would be covered because of the Section 2 coverage sa paragraphs A and B.
Yes. Yes, because
90%.
Yes, Mr. President, because the World Bank survey is on the basis of that is the minimum proficiency levels.
Yeah.
Meaning, if you have the minimum proficiency, for example, for reading, for mathematics, that is the proxy number that we use, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. So let's just assume that in one particular grade level there are 100 students. Under the Aral program, 90 of the 100 would be required to undergo the Aral intervention, which would be on an extra day or extra hours in the school premises, Mr. President. Kung ganyan kadami, 90%, At aminado natin, we need intervention because they have not learned the fundamentals of science, language, and mathematics. Isn't it better to just go back to the curriculum and review that curriculum?
Actually, Mr. President, the Department of Education is also re-engineering the curriculum, Mr. President, because we found out, and it was also validated by deped, that we have too many subjects and too many competencies. And what is happening on the ground is our students are being taught with so many subjects, but they're not learning because they lack the time in terms of studying on their own or processing the subjects that they are being taught with. So, Mr. President, there's a move right now to reduce the number of competencies and to reduce the number of subjects in our schools, Mr. President. And that was elaborated by our Vice President during her basic education report, in which for Key Stage 1, meaning kindergarten to grade 3, they will focus on numeracy and literacy.
Yeah, kasi Mr. President, if we are going to proceed with the current pace of teaching science, language, and mathematics, where only 10% understand, wouldn't it be better to step on the brakes, slow down the pace, allow the 90 to catch up during regular class hours, Mr. President, rather than proceeding with regular class hours, palayo ng palayo ang gap ni 10% sa 90% because we are using the words here, minimum proficiency level. And we're saying 90% do not have that minimum proficiency level. That means, Mr. President, subject matter, class day 1, then class day 2, class day 3, they will not be able to follow what was taken up in the class day 2, class day 3, because according to our description, they lack the minimum proficiency level, and 90% po ito. So, wouldn't it be the better approach, Mr. President, to just slow down the pace of classes and allow them to catch up?
Mr. President, I understand where our good minority floor leader is coming from. The 90% is really on the high side, but if you, I also showed another slide, no, and just to show the minority leader some of the rapid assessments that were conducted. Like for example, in NCR, Mr. President, let me just show the NCR slide. Page 3, NCR. Yung rapid assessment. For example, here, Mr. Is the comprehensive rapid literacy assessment conducted by the DepEd and USAID in NCR. If you look at the non-readiness or those students who are not ready in grades 1, grade 2, grade 3, they vary. No? 40% are not ready in grade 1, 36% are not ready in grade 2, 25% are not ready in grade 3. So meaning the 99% that I showed is a high number, no? And different regions will have different number in terms of readiness, Mr. President. So, in other words, Mr. President, I know where you're coming from, no? Because 90% is almost everyone. But when you conduct a much thorough and in detail assessment, you'll see different degrees. And also, if you break this down by city or by school, it will also become different. So the approach here, Mr. President, is the Aral program will now enable schools to address those learners who are not ready, depending on how many learners who are not ready in their schools. For example, in Valenzuela, this number will totally change because we have an intervention program on a regular basis, or our literacy numbers will probably be much lower than this because we have a constant regular intervention program every summer, Mr. President. So my point of the matter, Mr. President, the 90% is on the high side. But we are just making sure that we talk about the high side in order to plan properly moving forward. But definitely when we go granular, it become much different in that scenario. Even per school will be much different, Mr. President.
Mr. President, but I'm sure that
The next slide, if you
those who do not possess the minimum proficiency levels required in language, mathematics, and science, even on a per subject basis, would be substantial. Because if it were not substantial, no one would have thought of this Aral intervention program, Mr. President. They are substantial in number, Mr. President.
In terms of
And then my next question is, from the point of view of His Honor, what percentage is substantial?
well, Mr.
Enough.
President,
So substantial enough so that we need this Aral intervention.
well, Mr. President, in my personal opinion, every learner is very important, no? And that's why again, I indulge my colleague and good minority leader. I keep on referring back to Valenzuela because that's the only model that I have encountered. And even though in our number in Valenzuela, when we started our frustrated learners and frustrated readers and non-readers there, it's about 60%. We still launch our intervention program. And based on our experience there, our success rate is about 90%, meaning we managed to reduce non-readers and frustrated readers by about 90%. The 10% is what the good minority leader pointed out, that they can be helped during the regular class hours already. No? So that's the model that we followed. So in this particular case, applying it to the national scale, when we were studying this bill, we factored in the high side, which is the number that we've seen from the World Bank. But when we go granular, it will go down. But what is important here is we have already a law that is ready to intervene, no? If necessary. If the school thinks it's necessary, then they can use the program to intervene already.
Optional po ba pala ito sa school level? I thought this would be, if this becomes a law, this becomes available nationwide, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, we are giving
Especially in a public school. Optional in the private schools, but
Yes.
in the public schools,
In the public school, Mr. President, we're giving the principal and the division the flexibility to apply what type of intervention program. Like, for example, an intervention program can be one-on-one, or it can be, in Valenzuela, it's 25:1. In some models that we've seen, it's 10:1. So we'll give them the flexibility depending on the learner, depending on the assessment, and depending on number of learners that they will see who will need the intervention program.
no, but there will be an Aral intervention program. It's just on the mechanics, on the class size, maybe on the schedule.
Like Mr. President,
Aral would be available to all and required of all if you fall under Section 2, Mr. President.
yes, Mr. President, like for example, one of the most important features of the Aral program is Section 7, which is tutors under the Aral program. We expanded the types of tutors that can be tapped by deped. For example, if you are a student taking up education, your practicum or your on-the-job training can be served as credits when you apply to deped. If you are taking, let's say I'm a college student and I'm taking literacy training service, the credits for LTS can be used for your NSTP. So those type of concepts can now be used by the different divisions, by the different schools. It's available now nationwide because it's not available nationwide. For example, if a school in Nueva Ecija wants to tap college students, they cannot do it unless the university will talk to them. No? So, but with this law, they will now have a core of tutors that they can tap into.
Mr. President, you would agree with me that there would be a case, an actual class where 90% diba, of the students, let's say in mathematics, would not have the minimum proficiency level. Let's us imagine this class, 90%. Kasi let's say in Valenzuela, mababa. So para maging 90% sa nationwide, meron dapat mataas. I'm sure merong mataas.
Yeah.
Under current law and current DepEd circulars, doesn't the teacher have the flexibility to slow down the pace of the class, slow down the pacing of the lesson plan to allow the 90% to catch up with the 10%? Kasi otherwise, pansinan ni teacher, ang kausap niya, sa 100, 10 lang ang kausap niya, yung 90, kalat-kalat na po yung mata. And then, alam naman, Monday to Friday, itutuloy niya yung ganong situation. Then Saturday, mag-aaral naman yung 90, Aral Program.
Yeah.
It's all pointless, Mr. President. We wasted the 5 days of the 90%.
Mr. President, that has been a subject of long debate, no? And there's actually a allegation that DepEd is passing students who cannot read and who cannot count to the next level. That has been an allegation that I've heard many times. But the scenario on the other side, Mr. President, if the 90% students, so the 90% of learners who are not proficient in math will not be given assistance, the effects there is the teacher, it's either the teacher will fail them, all 90%, they will be carried over to the next, to the same grade level, or the teacher will probably undertake some form of intervention program, or remedial class or other intervention program. But in that particular case, the teacher will need additional help, definitely. The teacher cannot come up with a remedial program and teach all 90%. They will need additional tutors or need additional teaching aids. This is where the law will come in. No?
So as I get from the answer, Mr. President, there is no flexibility as of the moment. Kasi in effect, the teacher will have to follow the lesson plan, communicate with only 10% of his or her students, and then rely on the Aral intervention program so that the 90% can catch up. Sana, in this particular case, kasi it's obvious that it's either the teacher is not an effective teacher, or the lesson plan is really to start with beyond already the competence or proficiency of the students from class day 1. So therefore, there should be some flexibility for the teacher to slow down the pace. I mean, back to basics yan, back to basics for the next 5 or 2 weeks so that the 90% can catch up.
Yeah, Mr. President, I understand where the good minority leader is coming from. I think in terms of slowing down, you can only slow down so much. No? You cannot slow down to the extent that you use up the 200 schooling days of the year. I think they can slow down to an extent that the 90% or the majority of the students can catch up. But eventually, they will have examination, and the deciding factor there is whether you pass or you fail your students. No? So in normal practice, the teacher will employ remedial classes, intervention programs, tutoring, talk to the parents to help the students. And this is where we are now giving some tools to our teachers and to our schools to use in order to help the student. No? These are the tools that we are giving them.
But it's the same, Mr. President. It's the same concept. It's an after-class intervention.
Yes,
I'm asking about the during class flexibility. So,
Meron naman.
does the teacher have that flexibility?
Yes, Mr. President,
Pwede.
there is.
Okay.
The teacher will have flexibility, but it's not, it can only do so much, no? Because they have 200 school days to follow. They have a lesson plan and a plan to what to teach for the next 200 days. And the teacher can only have so much flexibility in terms of how to execute that lesson plan, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, so this will be required, we're not using the word mandatory, but required at all public schools from K to 10 grade levels, available to private schools upon request. So therefore, this will necessitate a large manpower pool, Mr. President, to execute the said program. I think the law mentions, the bill mentions teachers, para teachers, and tatlo. And student tutors,
The
Mr.
student
President.
tutors, yeah.
They are defined in the measure, but these tutors, let's call them tutors, Mr. President, are compensated, if I'm not mistaken, for their time.
Yes, Mr. President.
So, can we talk about the budget that we have projected for an effective Aral program, Mr. President?
Okay. Mr. President, I'll show a slide. No? Again, in the absence of an actual in the absence of an actual assessment system, we use a benchmark number that we came out from our research, and this is 550 pesos. This is the learner, 550 pesos per learner. This is a recommendation from World Bank based on their study on many intervention programs around the world. And just to give the body an idea, right now, through an MOOE, we pay about 250 pesos a year for elementary and 480 pesos a year for junior high school. So 550 pesos is more vicinity. And the 550 pesos is basically the optimum allocation per student, Mr. President. And I'll show you another slide, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just to be clear, so if the tutor has, let's say, 10 students, he can be expected to be compensated at 5,500? Ganun po ba? Is that the value of that per learner allocation?
The budget cap, sir.
Well, that is the budget for the entire program, Mr. President. And I'll go later on.
On the left side, Mr. President, yung MOE allocation per learner, I don't get it. Is that our total budget for deped and we divided it with the learners?
Yes, Mr. President. That's amount of
What the state spends?
yes,
for
to operate the schools.
Yeah, for each elementary student and for each junior high school student.
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes,
So
thank you.
just to give you some point of comparison, Mr. President, we looked at other intervention programs, no, around the world. For example, in the United States, they allocated about $122 billion. That's about $2,400 per learner. We'll flash that on the slide. In the UK, it's $1.2 billion. That's about $333 per learner for secondary school, and $175 per primary school per student in the primary school. But we also compared developing nations such as Bangladesh and India, and on a per learner basis, in Bangladesh, it's about $8 per learner. So that's about 400 pesos, more or less. And in India, it's about $6 per learner, more or less, Mr. President. So that's about 300 pesos per learner. So we more or less looked at the budget or the amount spent per learner, Mr. President, and this is the benchmark that we saw, Mr. President. So if you multiply that, for example, by the number of, should I this that? In 7 billion.
Mga 10 billion yata. Wait, multiplied by 19 million, no? The expected,
98, sir. 98.
should we multiply it by 19 million, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. Yes. Yung,
Mga 10 billion.
in 7 billion.
10.4 ang sa akin. 10.4.
16, sir. In 7 billion.
Hindi ko na nabansa. Late yung mga ano, yung na picture ano ba?
Here. Yes. This one, Mr. President, to cover to K to 6, because we put the priority will be K to 6, kindergarten to grade 6. The amount needed is about 7 billion. For K to 10 is about 10 billion, Mr. President. But we also have to put this in context, Mr. President, based on the NEDA report. NEDA ran some studies that if we continue business as usual right now, without any intervention program, the country stands to lose about 10.1 trillion pesos in the next 40 years in terms of productivity and income loss, Mr. President. So if you divide 7 billion, assuming we just target the priority grades, 7 billion divided by 10 billion, that's or 10 trillion is it's about 0.07%, Mr. President, for a one-year program. So in other words, Mr. President, we also need to look at
the losses.
the adverse effect if we don't do anything, no? And NEDA has already projected productivity losses, income losses, if you don't do anything, no? That's why NEDA is also proposing to to launch an intervention program so we minimize or mitigate the productivity losses, Mr. President. So my point of the matter there is we have to put this in context also, Mr.
Yes,
President.
Mr. President. So, the short answer would be around
The short
10
answer will
billion?
be around
10
7 billion.
7?
7.
Mr. President, Section 5 gives us the coverage for language and mathematics, grades 1 to 10. And
Yes,
then
Mr.
for
President.
science, grades
Yeah.
3 to 10.
Yeah.
So it does not stop at grade 6, so up to 10. So
Yes, Mr.
10
President.
So you have to use the
High side.
the
Yes, Mr.
10 plus billion pesos, Mr.
Yes, Mr. President, you're correct, Mr. President. I only, we during our hearing, Mr. President, the resource persons emphasized that in terms of prioritization, the K to 6 should be prioritized. But you're right, Mr. President, that the program will run until grade 10, up to
Well, we
grade
can,
10.
if that is the intention of the sponsor, Mr. President, we can amend the wording of Section 5 to reflect some prioritization if the sponsor is open to that, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I'm more than happy to receive suggestions.
Mr. President, Senator Tolentino wants to be recognized.
Mr. President, yes,
Mr. President.
just an interjection with
Yes, Senator Tolentino is
the
recognized.
permission of the two gentlemen.
Yes,
Mr. President,
Mr.
I recall during our last debates that the notion of having an executive program for this was accepted by the good sponsor. May I know if in all the estimations made, the concept of an abridged Aral program
Yeah.
was likewise computed?
No, Mr. President. The computation here did not take into consideration the abridged or the shortened Aral program. This is calculating the high side of the program, Mr. President. So, but definitely, if you go through the bill, Mr. President, we put a lot of emphasis on learner-centered intervention. So, meaning the learner should be what is good for the learner should be put as a priority. No, it cannot be a one-size-fits-all intervention for all students. We have to really assess what the learner needs, and based on what the learner needs, it can be the regular long program or the abridged program, depending on how the learner will catch up, Mr. President. But in essence, we're just giving the schools the tools in order to launch an intervention program.
Just two quick questions, Mr. President. The good minority leader was asking about the assessment needs. Who will assess the students? That's number one. Who will assess the tutors? That's number two. And is it part of the cost estimates that we have now? How do we evaluate the success? How do we put a correct parameter or barometer as to the success of this program, Mr. President? Yun lang po. Maraming salamat for the time given to this representation, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the learners will be assessed by deped because the infrastructure is already there. And typically, they will have rapid assessments to determine the proficiency levels of the student. In terms of the tutors, Mr. President, for example, in Section 7, for tertiary level students, they should be above the 75th percentile of the respective school. So we're just getting the cream of the crop, so to speak, Mr. President. But even though they are the cream of the crop, DepEd will still come up with training programs in order for them to be effective tutors for under this program. So for example, if you're a student studying, let's say, engineering, you should be above 75% percentile, and then you will still be trained by DepEd because not all engineering students can be good tutors. No? So you'll be also be trained by DepEd. But that will happen in the schools already. And we have master teachers, we have principals, we have the whole DepEd infrastructure per school that can do the training, Mr. President. They don't have to come to Metro Manila to be trained. It will happen in our schools, Mr. President.
Just one quick question, Mr. President. So is Your Honor now speaking of a mini licensure, mini LET exam for the tutors? LET for the tutors?
No, Mr. President.
An abridged training program which would lead to a certification for the tutors that would eventually pave the way for them to step up and become a full LET practitioner, Mr. President.
No, Mr. President. We just want to tap college students, as tutors because we have a lot of college students who are who can act as tutors because they have the basic skills, they have the basic knowledge, especially in terms of tutoring on reading, tutoring on mathematics. So those are the subjects that they will be tutoring in. And these are just fundamental subjects that we feel that our college students can help out in terms of tutoring.
I mentioned that, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I mentioned that, Mr. President, because perhaps in 5 or 6 or 7 out of 100 tutors, some of them will be enticed to join the teaching profession eventually, paving the way for the additional membership in our teaching force. And these are students now who are really passionate to teach, Mr. President. So perhaps the notion of giving them an opening to become teachers later on would really hit two birds in one stone. You teach the students and you produce a new crop of teachers. Yun lamang po, Mr. President. Maraming salamat.
Yeah, Mr. President, you're absolutely correct. In fact, that came out during our hearing that those who serve as tutors should be given some form of merit priority in DepEd. So we included in Section 15 that your experience as tutors will be considered as part of your merit selection plan to be promulgated by the CSC, Mr. President. So, in other words, if you were tapped as tutor, it will form part of your credits or your merits when you apply to DepEd.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shall resume. So, these tertiary level students who will be acting as tutors are given incentives under Section 15 and also to be credited with the LTS, Literacy Training Service, under the NSTP. Yung NSTP po ba, that is administered by the CHED, as far as I understand, Mr. President. So by virtue of this section, the CHED will already will already credit them with the NTSP.
Yes, Mr.
Credits?
President. That's the intention, Mr. President. So there are three components: the CWTS, the LTS, and the ROTC. If you are taking the LTS, because LTS is Literacy Training Service, which part of your activity is to teach.
Yes.
And most of the students who take the LTS are education graduates or education students. It will form part of their credit already.
See, yung current LTS, tinuturuan mo, tertiary din. Yung current LTS, Mr. President, under the NSTP, mga volunteer students din yun, tertiary level students din. Sino po ba tinuturuan nila doon sa LTS?
Iba-iba, Mr. President. It really depends on the college.
So,
They have a
pwedeng-
different. It really depends. Sometimes they're deployed to geographically isolated areas, and they teach there. It depends.
Yes, to teach basic education or tertiary level also students.
These are college students,
Yeah,
and they teach different. May basic education.
Okay. So,
May OSY. Yeah, I know
may
some
O-
of them
okay.
are top even for ALS in
Sige.
some areas. Depends on
Okay.
the program, Mr.
So
President.
there is, yes, so it's under the existing LTS, a tertiary level student can teach basic education student, grades from K to 10, di ba?
Yes.
Theoretically, pwede mangyari yun.
Yeah.
But since the Aral program compensates now the tertiary level student who will tutor under Aral, will this not kill now that LTS program where we have volunteer students not compensated, di ba? Under the NSTP, they are not compensated. So will this program possibly kill that aspect of the NSTP where there is LTS tertiary level student teaching K to 12 students, Mr. President?
No, not really, Mr. President, because if I'm a student, as an example, if I'm a student, then I volunteered to be a tutor. I can use that time as a tutor and apply it as credits to my LTS. No, so, in other words, it's an incentive for me. No, so instead of, let's say, I'm an LTS student and I'm deployed to teach, let's say OSY, out of school youth. I will now choose the Aral program because I get credits from that program, Mr. President. So I have now options.
You get more than credits, Mr. President. Di ba? Isn't that the tertiary level student compensated?
They're not but they can be compensated. They can be compensated. But it's for this LTS, they will not be compensated. Only the credits will be applied, Mr. President.
So thank you for that clarification, Mr. President. So incentive nga. Kung ganon, if there is no compensation, it's still purely volunteer work.
Yes, Mr.
Still
President.
purely volunteer work. Yes.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. President. Can we now go back to Section 5, Mr. President? Inumpisahan natin si Aral from K to 10. Bakit as early as K? Ang sabi ng law, for kindergarten learners, the Aral program shall focus on building foundational skills aimed at strengthening their literacy and numeracy competencies. Ba't hindi natin gawing part of the curriculum po ito sa kindergarten level, Mr. President?
Yeah, Mr. President, in our discussion during the hearing, well, number one, the kindergarten forms part of the formative years of of the youth, of the child. And it's important to strengthen the foundational skills of the child during those years, especially on numeracy and literacy. At the same time, Mr. President, another reason is we have to remember that these students, the kindergarten, never attended schools for 2 years. Some of them never seen a teacher. Some of them have never talked to any classmates. And with our discussion with the expert, they also want to come up with an intervention program for these students so that their foundational skills will be strengthened, especially on mathematics, science, and reading.
Yung example po ba natin, yung pumasok na who did not enroll for 1 or 2 years, when they go back to school, they're at kindergarten level. Yan po ba yung example po natin? Therefore, that child will undergo the lesson plans for the kindergarten level.
Yes, Mr. President.
Kaya nga, it does not build foundational skills aimed at strengthening their literacy and numeracy competency. Isn't that part of the current kindergarten lesson plan, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, it's part of their curriculum, Mr. President. And of course, we want the student to go with the curriculum. However, we also admit that some of the students are falling behind their subjects and proficiency levels. So
That early, Mr. President?
yes, Mr. President,
So sinusukat na sila that early and then they fall behind. Hindi pa ba dapat nga foundational skills nga yung
Yeah,
Kasi I'm questioning, I'm focusing my question here, Mr. President, is because if the kindergarten student is required to undergo aral, hindi po ba that child is required to either stay extra hours in school or come back on a non-school day for the Aral program? That's the implication, Mr. President. So why not why not tweak the kindergarten curriculum? Teach them the basics if they are not yet taught the basics, Mr. President.
I get the point of the good minority leader, Mr. President. I get your track, Mr. President, and I do agree, Mr. President. When we were discussing this bill, Mr. President, we just want to make the tools available from kindergarten all the way to grade 10, Mr. President. And based on our discussion with the experts and also with the Department of Education, the tutoring program can happen as early as kindergarten, strengthening their foundational skills during those times. So if, for example, they see that a student in kindergarten, especially coming from marginalized families, will need additional intervention, then they have tools that they can tap into, for example, tutoring, to help the student or the students, Mr. President. So that is the discussion during the hearing. But I totally see where the good minority leader is coming from.
Siguro yan, we have to revisit yung sa kindergarten talaga na, well, at saka actually in Japan, Mr. President, as far as I know, they don't give grades to up to a certain level, kinder to up to a certain level, kasi the point is, what they want the children to learn in school are social skills, maybe etiquette, good behavior, ganun eh. So, ngayon tayo, sa kinder pa lang, we claim that we already can spot a child who is not having the minimum proficiency level in science, language, and math at kinder level. Then we will require that child to stay extra hours or come back on another school day. Why not just tweak the curriculum, Mr. President, and then teach them? Kasi yung hindi pa nga applicable yung back to basics na salita sa kanila eh. Because this is the time that they are now learning the basics.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, Mr. President, going Minority Leader. I see where your focus is. I think maybe we can just tweak the wording in this measure. I think our intention is to give DepEd the tools, no, through the tutors, through the incentives, in order to help kindergarten students strengthen their foundational skills. Again, the kindergarten students will have the classroom, but admittedly, some students will need extra assistance in order to cope up, and that's where the bill will come in. But I can see the point of the good Minority Leader.
Siguro,
Yeah, and we
yeah,
can,
if the sponsor is open to, amending the coverage,
Yes.
siguro ganun na lang. Let's allow our kindergarten students some playtime,
yeah,
socializing time. At the same time, introduction to the basics now.
Yeah.
They cannot, ulitin ko, they cannot go back to back to basics.
In
Ito
fact,
yung
Mr.
aral.
President, just to add to that, there's no science in kindergarten. The science subject is taught in grade 3, Mr. President. So I think it's just the wording of the law that that we need to tweak in order to reflect the intention. The intention really for kindergarten is to come up with an intervention program to strengthen foundational, just reading, counting, and that's it. No? And but they're not going to be in the same boat as, let's say, the grade 1 to grade 10 insofar as the other subjects are concerned.
I'll just summarize my point, Mr. President. No? Sa kindergarten level, we should not aim to intervene so that we will strengthen their foundational skills. That should be what they get at kindergarten level. I mean, so if the sponsor agrees, let's we can capture the wording. And now, thank you for answering my next question. Ang next question ko sana is why yung science intervention is grade 3, yung pala yun yung start ng
Yes.
start ng science
Science
lesson.
starts at grade 3.
Thank you for answering my next question. So you are mind reader now, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So yung training of the tertiary level students to become efficient tutors, nasama na po natin sa budget natin na 10 billion yun o hindi pa po? Kasi may gastos din po yan. The training of the students.
That's the training of the
Of the
tutors.
students who will become tutors.
Mr. President, we have a benchmark number, and we only came up with a benchmark number, Mr. President, because the program will really depend on the assessment, Mr. President. So, to answer you directly, it will be part of the 550 pesos, Mr. President. Yeah.
Yeah, part
Because
of
the 550 pesos, when we were looking at the Ghana model, it includes training, includes deployment, includes materials. That's the components of the Ghana model, Mr. President.
Okay, so Mr. President, I think through our exchange, this representation's understanding of the measure has improved, Mr. President. Pero yun lang po yung last question ko po siguro, why we stop at 10? Grade, hindi ko pa rin makuha yung na, you mean to say because after grade level 10, the students can now rely on the self-learning modules, even though they may be still deficient in the minimum proficiency levels, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. Based on our analysis, Mr. President, the self-learning modules are effective for independent learners. We're flashing it on the slide. So the likelihood of the grade 11 and grade 12 students is very low, Mr. President. So just to be targeted on the program. We concentrated on 6-year-olds until 16, Mr. President. So this is the justification that we used based on the World Bank
Mr. President,
presentation.
hindi po ba sa tunay na buhay may mga college students na nagpapatutor pa rin?
Meron, Mr. President. Yeah.
And then, kaya nga, so, sa
Yeah.
tunay na buhay yun, I mean, college ka na, lumampas ka na nga sa grades 11 and 12, nagpapatulong ka pa rin because nahirapan ka sa lessons mo sa college, meaning to say,
Yep.
mga, siguro, doon sa mga algebra, hindi pa rin niya maintindihan, di lalo na sa calculus, mga ganun. So I do not know where they got this idea, Mr. President, and so what if they can rely more on themselves to the self-learning modules? Ang tanong, isn't it a fact that there are also some who do not possess the minimum proficiency levels required in science, language, and math?
But Mr. President, we're focusing on the foundational skills, no? On 3 subject matters, which is math, science, and reading. And Mr. President, if you reach that higher grade levels, no, grades 11s and grade 12s, you should already know how to read, you should already know how to count, and you should have basic concepts in science, Mr. President. So the philosophy of the Aral Bill is to strengthen the foundation, no? And the subject matters being taught actually from junior high school to senior high school are not foundational subjects anymore. These are subjects that are more complex. So that's the philosophy. That's the reason why we didn't include senior high school anymore, Mr. President, because those are complex subjects already. These are just foundational subjects, Mr. President.
Okay, so talagang ano pala ito, in language, just reading, know how to read in Tagalog,
Know how to
in
read.
Tagalog, in Filipino, and in English siguro to?
Yes,
Ano po?
know how to read,
And then-
know how to count, and
And then
basic
count?
concepts.
Count up to 20? Gano'n? I'll count. Kasi
at least the basic, at least the basic
my daughter
numeracy.
who is not yet 3 years old can count up to 100 already, Mr. President.
Yeah, just
Pero-
the foundation lang, to strengthen the foundation.
So we can theoretically end this earlier, kung gano'n.
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes, so we can end it even before grade 10, gano'n?
Theoretically, yes, Mr. President. But based on our discussion with the experts, in fact, our initial thought on this is only grade 1s to 6. But deped and some of the experts suggested to us to expand it to grade 10, no? Because
What was the justification given, Mr. President, given your explanation that it is just about the basics of reading,
Yes.
writing, reading, counting, and science concepts?
the reason for that, Mr. President, based on their rapid assessment surveys, they are seeing some grade students from grade 6 to grade 10 who still need foundational support, no? Support in foundational subjects, no? And sad as it may be, they want the tools, no? The tutoring tools available in this law to be present when they give intervention programs to those students. It's sad, but they feel that they need those tools at least ready to be deployed.
Anyway, the longer the program is, the more chances for the learner to out of his or her own volition and initiative, learn the basics of science, language, and math.
Yes, Mr. President. But you're right. Initially, our thoughts on this is just K to 6, and because we feel that K to 6 are the most important years to build the foundation in order for the student to keep up in the junior and senior levels, senior high school levels.
So, thank you, Mr. President. Siguro, if the good sponsor will just entertain some tweaking of
Yes, Mr. President.
measure to make it siguro more realistic or feasible given our parati natin ginagamit limited fiscal space. Pero siyempre, this is education. priority ito if the money, the amount spent will go to a good cause naman eh.
Yeah.
Ano yung sir, 10 trillion yung
10.1
projected
trillion for the next 40 years. Productivity losses. Mr.
Productivity
President.
losses if we do not act. So,
Yeah.
so thank you for the time, Mr. President. At least this representation has been clarified about.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, to the good minority leader, and definitely he made excellent points in sharpening the bill, and will work with His Honor to come up with proposed amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.